And I'll turn it over to Michele, and it's going to be somewhat interactive, and then there's also going to be time for questions and answers towards the end. But Michele may invite us into active reflection throughout as well. Michele.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you everyone for giving up some of your time on this Thursday evening to be with us. And yeah, I think what we're going to do is we're going to go through a few of the slides. And then it seems to me there's kind of a natural place to pause and have a bit of a conversation, because I want to hear from you what some of your experiences were over the last particularly 2 years, and for us to talk about that a little bit so that you can maybe connect some of the theory with what you're seeing around you. So let's go ahead and start. And so it's just a little bit about me. And like Sean said, I went and did some further certification in grief recovery and in traumatology over the last couple of years, because I could kind of see it coming on the radar. And like he said, we're hearing more and more about it. You may have heard the phrase trauma-informed care. And so some of what we're talking about tonight relates very closely to trauma-informed care. But in this case, we're looking specifically at ministry and how this is part of what we can do in our communities. So I want to just start a little bit with basics about trauma. So trauma is not something that happens just to, soldiers or emergency responders. Like, that's what we previously thought. But I found this statistic quite startling, actually, that 76%, so 3/4 of us, have experienced at least one traumatic event in our lives so far. And about 1 in 10 Canadians will meet the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder over their lifetime. So we're talking about a condition that affects a huge number of people, including people in our churches. It's important to know that there is both epigenetic and environmental components to trauma. So what do I mean by epigenetic? Well, more and more research is showing us that trauma is actually encoded into our genetics. So not only women who are carrying children who experience trauma, and we can see actual physical changes in the genetic structure of the children that they bear, but we can see it even intergenerationally, that the way we respond to trauma is being genetically transferred to people, just like traits like the color of your eyes and the color of your hair. So that's one thing. The other thing is that, of course, there's environmental components to trauma. What environment you live in, what happens to you in that environment will definitely increase your chances of experiencing trauma or provide some protection against trauma. So what do we mean when we say trauma? We're talking about a natural response to an event that overwhelms our ability to cope with it. So I want to emphasize that trauma is a natural response. We tend to think of it as something that happens when people aren't, well adjusted or something. We need to change our thinking and understand that when something so unnatural, so unthinkable happens, that trauma is a natural response to that event. So responses to the same event can be very different. You can have a natural disaster, say like a flood occur in a community, and people will have very individualized and diverse reactions to that event. And trauma results in a number of symptoms that we can see, identify, that we experience in all facets of our being. So in the way we think, in our physicality, in our emotions, in the way that we behave, and as we look at in trauma-informed ministry, in people's spiritual lives. we see the impact of trauma in people's spirituality. So we talk commonly about kind of 3 types of trauma. So first of all, acute trauma is something that often occurs from an initial or a single event. So we think commonly of something like a flood, a forest fire, an earthquake, something like that where there's a huge singular event. But trauma can also be chronic. And what we mean by chronic trauma is trauma that has been repeatedly inflicted on someone over a long amount of time and prolonged traumatic events. So not likely to be quick events, but things that have gone on for a long time. So it could be, we would commonly see this in people who, provide care, like emergency responders, like people who are put in difficult situations. And something we haven't been talking about till recently, people engaged in ministry. And I always like to point out that funeral home directors are people that are constantly exposed to trauma, and yet we never think of them as being impacted by the trauma. And I think we probably should. So the last type of trauma is known as complex trauma. And this is what happens for people who have numerous experiences of traumatic events, but they're generally things that have been perpetrated on them by someone who should love and care for them. So this is what we see in childhood abuse that's perpetrated over a large amount of time, sexual abuse, domestic violence situations. So it has an extra component because the trauma is brought about at the hands of someone that should be trustworthy. Okay, so that's what we're briefly talking about when we discuss types of trauma. So trauma can be an experience individually, and it's known as a blow to the psyche. So something happens so suddenly and with such force that we cannot cope with it effectively. Collective trauma is a blow to the basic tissues of social life that damages the bonds attaching people together. And it impairs our sense of common communality. So we'll chat in just a bit more about that. But I think most of us would agree that the COVID pandemic was a global experience, and it was universally experienced by everybody. So, people were saying things like, we're not all in the same boat, but we're in the same storm. And that was very true. Some of us had more access to resources, and so our experience was mediated. But during this kind of collective trauma, all of our individual experiences of trauma have possibly been exacerbated, triggered, brought up old stuff for us in a way that was totally unexpected. And so people were overwhelmed by their response, experiencing this collective trauma. So I just want to go through this a little bit, and then I want us to just take a few minutes to talk about what we saw or didn't see with regards to trauma in ministry during the pandemic. So this is just a list of some of the things that communities of faith went through during the pandemic, and we all went through them to one degree or another: lockdowns, mask mandates, discussions about vaccine mandates, all of the communal experiences that we didn't get to celebrate together or mourn together. Some of us older ministers in particular, all of a sudden are having to learn how to do Zoom and live stream, and that was very stressful for some people. There was a lot of conflict, increased conflict within congregations about making decisions. A lot of financial stress as people stopped coming to church, people stopped supporting the work of the church financially. Volunteers disappeared for legitimate reasons, but ministers and volunteers found themselves kind of on their own. So that was part of what happened in communities of faith. Now, clergy and those engaged in ministry leadership, not just clergy, but they faced a very different work environment. There was a lot of increased interpersonal conflict. And I know for myself, feeling powerless, sometimes to keep people safe and also juggle the demands of meeting people's pastoral care needs was a huge stressor. A lot of people engaged in ministry just didn't enjoy it anymore because all of the things that we want to do as ministers, we couldn't do anymore. We couldn't visit people. We couldn't mourn with people. We couldn't be with people. And there was lots of inappropriate expectations about what we could do. And so a lot of ministry personnel and leaders experienced burnout. Now, Diane Strickland, who I quote quite a bit in this work, her and I are working together on trying to get this message out about trauma-informed ministry. She predicted 2 years ago or more that a lot of ministers would be leaving the ministry following the pandemic. And even in Living Skies region, we can see that people are moving on and a lot of people are thinking about, I think I'm going to leave ministry and do something else. So even though some of the things have eased, we are going to experience long-term consequences from the trauma that we faced during the pandemic. And beyond that, as we know, all of our life is susceptible to trauma. And perhaps the pandemic has made it even more obvious that when you are working in intimate and vulnerable ways with people, you will be exposed to others' trauma and to your own trauma. So I'd like us just to have a little chance to unmute for a few minutes and I just want to hear from you. Does this resonate? Is this what you experienced in your life in ministry or in your community of faith during the pandemic?
Yes.
Would you like to expand on that?
What really resonates for me is the grief and the constant worry about the impact that it will have on folks, the inability to gather as community when folks have died. We've had over 24 people in our congregation die since the pandemic started. And we've maybe had half a dozen funerals. And I just worry about what that means and how to be a pastor for folks in the midst of that.
Absolutely.
And the grief of especially people in hospitals and nursing homes and their families. So hard not being able to visit.
What else did folks experience during that time? Maybe there's something I didn't mention.
I would add to that the grief of communities. It was interesting when I was serving as interim in a small community in Manitoba that I came to the realization that, and during that period there was an event in which a bus was crashed in Quebec and killed about 40 people. And I realized at that point that the community I was serving also experienced the deaths of 40 people over the space of a year. And all kinds of support was offered to the community in Quebec, but we didn't recognize that in the community where we were, and the kind of impact on that, on the life of a community that maybe marginal in terms of surviving as a community, thriving as a community, that we underestimate that part of our life together, I think.
Anyone else?
One of the things that I noticed was similar to the fact, the phenomenon of cumulative grief when we experience multiple deaths and multiple forms of grief over time. There's sort of like cumulative trauma. And it was, you know, so we've got pandemic that I think isn't past tense yet, and we've got climate crisis, and we've got the pandemic of racism, and we've got all these multiple collective complex traumas happening over time. And it's just, there's something about that cumulative nature that just, it amplifies each one.
Absolutely.
I think for us, what was interesting is that as some of our key lay people stepped back because of their own health concerns, other people stepped into the void, and they were not always the best people to do that. Some of them were bullies. Some of them were very there was all kinds of personalities that kind of stepped into that void that made it even more difficult to deal with. A lot of the changes and the interpersonal conflict between people became more acute. And
and I noticed in our community for sure, that split between those who were anti-mask, anti-vax, and those that were for it. There was a huge divide, and it seemed to grow and get bigger. And I really worried, how do you bring all of them back at the, sooner or later we're going to have to come together, and is it even possible, and I mean, there's that that angst, I guess, of feeling alone, maybe sometimes feeling alone in that. So.
I don't know if other people will have had this experience, but the discovery and acknowledgement of the iron-marked graves moved me into touch with the horror of the residential schools in a way that I had not been in touch before. And I found myself imagining the children who died and the isolation they experienced, and how there was nowhere for them to find comfort, because the church that might have provided comfort was inflicting this on them. And that's been a fairly major, I guess, emotional struggle for me in the last year.
Anyone else want to weigh in just before we move on? I mean, we'll have more time at the end to chat, but anyone wanted to add anything about that in particular? No? Okay.
I have, so, you were talking about sort of the technological stuff and the strain of learning how to do it, and kind of the conflict within my community anyway, about who would or who would not participate in that, and the disappointments if we had something on Zoom or whatever, and then the people that I hoped would be there just weren't, anyway.
Yeah. You really couldn't ever please everybody. And I think we knew that, but we sure try. And it definitely made it harder, I think, to please people. So, okay, I'm just going to move us on a little bit and just talk more specifically about what are we talking about when we say trauma-informed ministry? What does that mean? Because you may have heard, trauma-informed care. So the purpose of trauma-informed ministry is to equip ministers and ministries to respond effectively to individual and collective trauma. And we do this in order to facilitate healing. And it is, of course, a natural fit with our understanding of the good news of the Christian gospel, which is the unconditional and ever-present love of God for God's people. So the purpose is that we can carry that out maybe more effectively or with greater skill and perception in some ways. And how it works is that trauma-informed ministry is a caring response to those who may be traumatized. And we give this response using principles that are known to be helpful to traumatized people. And we use these principles to communicate with them, to facilitate their healing, maybe not treatment so much, but we certainly encourage people to get treatment and healing. And so these principles that we are using are ones that have been developed over, a fairly extensive period of time. They are research-based. And so we take what has been applied in, psychiatric and psychological circles, and we use them, we apply them in the practice of ministry. So if you haven't encountered the work of Reverend Diane Strickland yet, I will give you a resource list at the end, but I strongly, strongly urge you to buy this little booklet that she has developed. I think it's about $20 or $25 or something, and she'll send it to you by email. But it is, as far as I've seen, the only kind of hands-on primer, basic manual for how we might work with these principles in ministry. So, when I was engaged in my traumatology courses and getting my certification, everything I read, everything that I learned said the number one principle that has to be in place before people can be begin healing or continue healing from trauma is safety. So people have to feel safe enough to share their experiences. And sometimes that's hard. As we begin talking about trauma more and more and normalizing the conversation, I hope that people will start to feel safer in that. But that has to be number one. One of the questions that, in hindsight, maybe would have been good to really think about during the pandemic in particular, but going forward is, where is anxiety gathering? Where is it gathering for individuals? And where is it gathering for groups? And I think we saw a lot of that in some of the conflict that was going on in our communities of faith. So in some places, the anxiety was gathering around, how to keep our seniors safe. And it might have been gathering around, well, we've been closed for 12 weeks and nobody will come back to church. And the treasure of the anxiety might have been gathering around, how are we going to pay the bills? And so as we become aware of when, where, and how anxiety is gathering for individuals and groups, we get a better sense of what's actually going on and how trauma might be at play in people's responses. The second principle we apply is trustworthiness. People who have experienced trauma have not had experiences of being able to trust people, being able to trust themselves. And so we demonstrate, which I think most of us do in ministry, the capacity to suit up and show up for others with whom we're engaged in ministry, but also for ourselves. And this next point I know is a little bit controversial, and maybe Shane and some of the other people who have recently graduated from seminary are gonna, jump up and scream liar at me. But in seminary, I remember very clearly being told that you know, there's this huge wall between you and congregation members, and whatever community you live in, you can't have any friends, and you can't be vulnerable, and you can't take risks, and you can't be yourself, and all this other stuff. And this is my opinion, I've come to believe that vulnerability is my superpower, and that I must, in order to do effective ministry, take risk in connecting with people. Sometimes that may mean, in some ways, sharing my own experiences with trauma, but it has to be in a way that serves the recovery and the healing of the other person. It can't be about me. And some of us may have heard, you know, that saying of, we help people from our scars, not our wounds. But sometimes we might have to pick our scab a little bit in order to connect with people. And I could say a whole bunch about that, but we could talk about that another time. The third principle is the idea of choice. People who have experienced trauma have experienced either very real lack of choices or a perceived lack of choice. So, you know, whether it's a real lack of choice of not having choices about where to live or how to live or where your next meal is coming from, or if you're going to be safe today, but also people who've experienced trauma have a lot of perceived lack of choices. So we might look, for example, if we take the subject of domestic violence, we might look at, you know, somebody who is living in that situation and say, well, you know, my understanding is people who live in domestic violence situations are, you know, poor, and they're unable to leave, and, you know, they have to have had, you know, somebody, you know, holding a gun to their head or something like that. And so we look at someone and we don't understand why this person with a professional career, who, you know, seems to have, you know, a lot of confidence in their professional life or whatever, why they don't just walk out. But people who have experienced trauma may not perceive that they have any real choice in how their life is going to go. So what we do in ministry and in trauma-informed care is that we empower people to make lots of choices. Large choices about how to spend their time, their money, their energy, but also small choices about, you know, what part you'd like to play in the service or not, what chair you'd like to sit in, would you like to go for a walk when we're having a conversation. One of the things that I feel very strongly about ministry, and this may be connected to trauma or not, is we need to give people lots of opportunities to opt out, to take breaks, to ask for what they need, just as we do as well. And so empowering people to have lots of choices and to know they have choices is crucial when we're dealing with people who have experienced trauma. Our fourth principle relates to collaboration. This is a very basic tenet of social work, which is the background that I come from, but we don't hear it so much in ministry. But in social work, the mantra kind of is, you work with people where they're at, and you understand that that particular individual is the expert on their own lives. We're not really trained that way in ministry practice. We're kind of trained like, you know, we're the experts and we're the God people and we're going to help you figure things out. And so trauma-informed work asks us to step back from that and to recognize that this person has been living with this trauma. They know what happened to them. And we're not the, you know, big messiah that's going to break into their lives with some wonderful way to heal that they've never thought of before. So we need to start where people are at and to recognize that they may have been on this journey dealing with trauma for a long time before we come into their lives. Some of the stress symptoms that we see, and I think we saw quite a bit of this exacerbated during COVID time, was things like rigidity in thinking. Things have to be done this way. We, at least I did, experience people not being able to consider other people's point of view, not able to consider another way of doing things. People were exhausted. And I'm sure you had conversations like I did with people who said, I don't know why, but I'm just so tired all the time. I haven't even done anything and I just feel exhausted. The other thing we didn't always know about people that we were interacting with was what their personal history of trauma is. You know, we live in a society, I think in some ways, where we love to wander into that realm of what I call toxic positivity, where, you know, we're kind of like every day in every way we're getting better and better. And a lot of the language that we use and the way that we interact is around that. You know, we love to lift up, you know, the brave cancer survivor and the, you know, the victim of something or other. And we like to, you know, really encourage them to stay cheerful and positive and battle on. And that can be really hard to take. And people need spaces in which they don't have to be kind of the cheerful survivor all the time. So for some people that can be going on as well. One of the things I think that's crucial that we ask is, where's my stress level at? If I'm engaged in ministry leadership and pastoral care with people, are my stresses from my trauma, or past or present, making it hard for me to lead in working with this person? And I think a lot of people, maybe at some point or another, realize this, but not everybody was given the space or the opportunity. Again, when you're experiencing trauma, you don't think you have real choices. So when I experienced this last year, I ended up taking some time off of work because I had been dealing with multiple traumas in my family and things that were going on in the pandemic. And I needed that space to step back. And I, to this day, credit that opportunity with keeping me in ministry, because I was not sure that I was going to be able to go on. So we need to have that space to say, I'm not the person to be doing this right now because of where I am in dealing with my own stuff. When we talk about the principle of empowerment, we need to encourage people and let them know that they have what it takes to recover from trauma, that they are the expert, that we can help them to be safe, that they have the ability to be with safe people and safe places. We need to allow people space to remember what happened to them, their original traumas or repeated traumas, and to mourn the loss of whatever happened there, the loss of safety, the loss of family, the loss of childhood, whatever it is. And then this is where the church can be such a positive force, where we assist people and facilitate them reconnecting to life and to other people in a safe way. So I really love this reminder that Diane Strickland always lays out there when she says, we are reminded to participate in God's love for us. This is the good news of the gospel. It's not that we have to figure out everything ourselves, that we have to have all the answers. We just need to be willing to participate in God's great, good, endless love for each of God's people. And that's a message I think that people cannot hear enough. I know I need to hear it. And finally, and this is something I think we're very aware of for the most part in the United Church of Canada, the awareness of and sensitivity to identifiable trauma impacted groups. So what are we talking about? We're talking about people who, for whom by their very existence, have experienced persistent trauma, multi-generational trauma, or unacknowledged trauma. And some of those I think would come, very quickly and easily to our minds. So as a Métis person, it's very much in my mind that my connection to Métis culture was something that I had to engage in as an adult and to find my own way, because my family didn't talk about it because you were ashamed of being Métis, and so you tried to pass for white. And we know, we've already talked about it tonight, what the impact of multi-generational trauma has done and continues to do for our Indigenous siblings and for non-Indigenous people in our country. So we know that. We know the persistent trauma that happens to groups of people, and some of it's unacknowledged. So people with disabilities experience trauma all the time, and yet we don't really acknowledge that in the way that we could. We know that racialized people experience trauma. Women experience trauma. We looked at an article, we were doing some work with Shining Waters about trauma and ministry. And we read an article about the trucker convoy that happened in Ottawa and some of the things that were happening. And it was very interesting that a lot of the particular women who were in the group talked about how triggered they were by that experience, by these men and these big trucks hooting and hollering and yelling like sexualized comments and intimidating them and coming up and ripping masks off their faces and stuff. And so women tend to react to that in a way that just says, for women, fear of assault is a persistent risk of trauma. And we face it all the time. It limits our lives, it limits our choices. So that's an example of kind of unacknowledged trauma that people might experience. So we need to again underscore the fact that trauma is a natural response to systemic, unjust, and inhumane treatment of groups of people. So there's no way that you can experience persistent trauma and just carry on as normal. So for us to hear things like, well, they should just get over it, or it's not that big of a deal, or, I was poor too when I was a kid, so I don't know what people's problems is minimizing and failing to acknowledge this is a natural response to something that is not right in our world. So I just want to, finish up a bit before we have some more conversation and talk about what is particular about this trauma-informed ministry model, that what might it have to share for us as people of faith specifically. So the TIM model shifts trauma-informed care inward. So most of the time, what we call trauma-informed care is something that professionals apply, or tools or approaches that they use when they're working with other people, right? And so we do that, obviously. We've been talking about doing that in our ministry with other people. But the twist is that everyone who is engaged in ministry benefits from applying the principles to themselves and receiving them from other people. So not only do we, as are engaged in our ministry work, apply these principles of safety, trustworthiness, and so on to other people, we apply them to ourselves. And we expect to receive them from other people as well. This, I think, awareness of trauma and the impact it can have on individuals and communities means that identifying and healing our own trauma is good and necessary. And I remember when I was taking a grief recovery specialist course, the facilitator said something that really kind of hit me between the eyes. She said, discovery is not recovery. Discovery is not recovery. In other words, knowing some, intellectual theories about trauma, reading a book on trauma, or recognizing that trauma might be at play for other people is not the same as recovery from our own trauma. I've done quite a bit of work in this area over the last couple of years, and I'll be reading a book about trauma. I need to read for a while, I need to put it down, and I need to recognize that my responses are related to my own trauma. A quick example of something that happened, I was in a clergy gathering and somebody was talking about how they were kind of inferring that, all of us who were in ministry were all, we all grew up in these nice Christian families and we all had money and we were all loved and everything like that. And I felt compelled to tell her that not all of us grew up like that. That's a good example of unacknowledged trauma. Like when I'm talking to some of my church people, and they're telling stories of picnics and berry picking and stuff with their family and how happy they were. To me, that's just like something I might see in a Hollywood screen because that wasn't my experience. So if we're not healing our own trauma, it's going to come back. It's like grief. We all know about grief, that grief, you can defer it for a while, but it's patient and it will come back and it will demand attention. I believe that trauma does the same thing. So this kind of wraps up the philosophy around this. Why should we care about trauma-informed ministry? Because we're called to share in the ministry of Jesus. And because we choose to walk towards trauma in many forms. Being engaged in ministry and pastoral care means we run toward when everybody else runs away. We are the people who hear things like, oh, I could never do what we do, right? We go towards people and we participate collaboratively in the work of the Spirit as we do so. And I think this really sums it up. Ministry is marinating in trauma. There is no way that I've been able to ascertain that we can engage in ministry and not be continually rubbing edges with trauma, either our own trauma or other people's. So this reminder that God, Jesus, Spirit are always at work and that we are called to come alongside to participate in that work of recovery and healing. So I know that's a lot and we talked really, really fast, and I would rather do a 2-day workshop on something than do an hour workshop because it's so hard to give you stuff in an hour. But let's just take a minute for questions or comments or to lift something up that maybe we didn't talk about. And then I do have a resource list at the end, and I'm also happy to share the PowerPoint notes if people would like it.
Thank you, Michele. That's awesome. Michele, do you want to stop your screen sharing for a bit so that we can all see each other, or do you want to keep this up so that you're able to share resources?
That's fine. No, that's
okay.
good.
Sometimes nice that we can all see each other on screen. So lots of stuff there, especially those 6 principles. And I saw lots of people nodding and lots of note taking. So responses and questions for Michele and for each other, folks.
I just want to say thank you so much. I haven't had this framework before. I didn't get it anywhere else, but everything you were saying, I was like, yes, yes, yes. Um, I had worked in prison ministry and also ministry in a jail. And now I'm in a hospital, which is so much like a jail. She can't leave, and it's traumatizing. And these things are things I think the first three things, like trustworthiness, huge, huge. Safety, choice. Do you want to talk now or later, or maybe not today? Just even saying that, it opens up a whole world. And I said a lot of wrong things before I figured out that, but I love this presentation. I think this is maybe part one, Rev. Got to do more. Thank you.
Thanks, Em.
Michelle, I think that you use the term toxic positivity. And I really like that, because I kind of think that I understand where you're going with that. But can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. I'm just going to grab something. You probably heard Tracy talk about this woman. I feel like I can take credit for introducing Tracy Martin this, but it's a woman called Kate Bowler, and her latest book is called Good Enough, 40-ish Devotionals for a Life of Imperfection. And I found Kate Bowler a few years back when I read a book of hers where she called Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved. So I was just taken by that title, of course. And she used to be, she's a history prof at Duke Divinity School, and she used to write about the prosperity gospel ministries in the States. And then she was in her early 30s, and she was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer and told she had a few months to live. And ever since then, her ministry, I consider it a ministry, her ministry is to tell people that this message of, if you only believe enough and try hard enough and do good enough and, think positively enough, that your life is going to be happy and fulfilled and awesome, and you're going to be, feel great and godly and spiritual and all that kind of crap. And, that hasn't been my experience in life. My experience, even in ministry, has been an amount of wonderful blessings interspersed with a whole lot of really hard stuff, personally, professionally. And so I think there's something very, very freeing about blowing a hole in this toxic positivity stuff. And we're pretty good at in the United Church. Like, we're smart enough now. We know you don't go Happy Mother's Day, and we know it's not great for everybody, right? Like, we're pretty good at stuff like that. But, you've all heard it. If you're preaching, somebody comes up to you and says, oh, I just love that. What is that idiot? Joel Osteen. Oh, I just love that. Joel Osteen. Why can't everybody preach like him? Because he just tells everybody, if you just, think the right thing and buy my books, you're going to be rich and you're going to be healthy and you're going to be happy and all that stuff. So one of the gifts of ministry we have is to give people space to just be real. And I think that's why my people love me, because I'm not a great preacher. I'm not very religious. I'm not very spiritual. I mean, I have great hair, but that's about all I got going for me. But I'm real. And they can come into my office and they can be real. And it's a relief. It's a relief, especially when you live in a small town where, if somebody had a feeling, they'd dig a hole to bury it, right? So that's kind of my mantra is, down with toxic positivity And let's try to have a good enough life, a good enough ministry, a good enough marriage, a good enough everything.
I found it interesting, Michelle, that the comment around toxic positivity came actually right before the principle about empowerment, and how sometimes those two things can get crossed, because we do want to empower people, and we do want to inject some degree of hope, or help people find some degree of hope. But it's so easy to mix that up with just the superficial positivity. So, yeah.
Yeah, good point. Yeah. Dexter.
I found myself thinking about the last place I offered interim ministry, and how much I might have benefited from what you've spoken of tonight as I provided the interim ministry there. The congregation had experienced a major blow up in the context of a worship service, in which the minister was confronted by a member of the congregation in terms of the inadequacy. And I'm not saying he was wrong or that the person confronting him was wrong, but the way in which he did it may not have been very helpful. And there were people in fear of safety in the midst of the confrontation, ready to dive under pews. And I mean, intuitively and instinctively, I responded to some of that, but I don't think I did it intentionally. And what you've shared tonight would have encouraged me to do it intentionally and perhaps more effectively. And I think this becomes a major factor as we move forward and congregations struggle with their continuing viability. The trauma is going to be a major element in that. And so what you're sharing with us needs to be part of our conversation, certainly as ministers, and perhaps somehow as church overall, because it will affect how we relate to each other within the regions.
Yeah. 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 Thank you for sharing that, Dexter. And it will also, it will greatly impact the health of people engaged in ministry. And in my personal opinion, if we don't start investing some time, energy, money, and intentionality into encouraging and strengthening and taking care of people engaged in ministry, whether it's clergy or lay leaders or whatever, we're not going to have them. And we can already see that. So I have a real passion for that. So thank you for that. Anyone else? I know it's a tough topic. Everybody looks like they need to have a bubble bath. And
Can you?
I have a story about. Well, I live in the Sask housing unit in Abbey, and another person who lives here. We have coffee every morning, and he had cancer when he was young as a kid. So he would be in the hospital, and his parents would have to take him to the hospital, and then he'd come back to school, and people wouldn't play with him because he was, different, and so many things. And he's pretty cognitively, or so, I don't know. He doesn't pay his bills, and so he's under kind of supervision now from somebody who keeps his money, and every day he complains about that he doesn't have money. Anyway, the other day he's been struggling with backache and his headaches, and so I said to him, well, no, I didn't say to him. He said, I really want to make an appointment with a chiropractor that I know. And I said, this is good, and because he hadn't taken the initiative to call people very often. So he made the appointment. The person who is kind of his caretaker said, well, you can't do that because you need to go to a doctor first, and then he will tell you or not to go to the chiropractor anyway. So so he didn't go to the chiropractor that day. And I kind of said, you know, if you were to make another appointment, I would take you. So that's why I didn't go to the clergy meeting on Tuesday, because I was driving. But when you talked about, you know what you need, and you can, I thought it was, so I just was glad that I did that for him.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you.
Michelle, can you say something about as leaders, you know, sometimes when we're stuck in the middle of our own stuff, how do we know, or how do we help others see that it's time to take a step back and maybe deal with that before engaging in helping others? Like the put your own mask on thing first. I think like I can think of several ministers that I've encountered over the years who just clearly they're not healthy enough to be in a leadership position. And I don't want to end up in that situation myself. So can you just speak to that a little bit? Well, I honestly feel like I have a real advantage because I came to ministry late in life. I didn't grow up in the church, which when I went into seminary, I thought, oh, that's terrible. Everybody's way ahead of me. And now I'm like, oh, thank you, Jesus, that I don't have all this baggage that I have to unpack, right? But I honestly did not learn much about being honest and taking care of dealing with my own stuff. I learned almost nothing about that in seminary. I learned it around the tables of Alcoholics Anonymous and Al-Anon. So I was very, very fortunate in that, you know, I had that experience of truth telling, of safety, of being accepted for who I was long before I came to the church. And there's a lot of things about 12-step programs I think we should be taking piecemeal and putting them into the church. In fact, one of my previous congregations, I did a 12-step series and everybody loved it except for one woman who was so mad, and her and her partner left the church over it. And then about 3 years later, I got a message from her saying she was in AA, but she was so mad because she thought I was doing this 12-step series just to sober her up. It was quite hilarious. But anyways, so I think that's part of it. I think that part of this professionalization of our role is like we're not like doctors. Like we have an education like a doctor, but it's not a relationship where somebody comes into your office, lists off their symptoms, you write a prescription, they go away. This is an intimate, feeling, interactive, collaborative relationship. And in my opinion, you should not be in ministry unless your heart is in it. This is not a job you just punch a clock, right? So it takes a lot out of us. And this idea that we can compartmentalize, or again, discovery is not recovery. Compartmentalizing these pieces of ourselves and thinking that when my soul is sick, or my heart is empty, or my brain is foggy, I can still somehow show up every day and do this stuff, is absolutely unreasonable. It just doesn't work. And in my opinion, if we don't address it, people are just going to walk wholesale away from ministry. I have a friend I've never met in person. She's a Facebook friend. She did not even make 5 years in ministry, and she's working in an insurance office. I cannot imagine the hell that would force you into working in insurance. Like for me, that would be a nightmare, numbers and paper and all that stuff. But I mean, that's how difficult it was for her to deal with ministry. Again, I think reading is good. For me, I had to take up this kind of desire to learn more about trauma. And man, I've got a lot of it. There was some of the stuff I knew about, right? But there was a long history of trauma that I wasn't aware of. And so one of my triggers is bullying. I cannot stand bullying because I was abused as a child. I was bullied as a child. Well, what did we see in COVID? We saw tons and tons of bullying in our churches, in our communities, right? And that was a big issue for me. Now, what happened for me in one instance was, and I don't think this hardly ever happens, my council have jam to kick a bully off council and tell this person, you are not allowed in leadership at this church at this time because you are not in good enough space to be a leader in this church. That almost never happens, right? Bullies are kind of allowed to run free. And we saw a lot of people with their own trauma who responded in bullying ways during the pandemic. Again, we need to think of ways we can support people without enabling their bullying. So I guess, Lindsay, that my response would be, we need to do our own work and we need to make it okay to be vulnerable. And we need to be able to go to one another in leadership or whatever and say, I'm not doing well. I can't do this. What can I do? We need someone to show us our choices when we don't feel like we have any. And, you know, I took time off and guess what? The church did not fold. They survived. They did just fine. And they had an opportunity, you know, I'm not saying time off is always the answer, but they gave love to me. And that was a new experience for me. Ministry is not, in my opinion, a job where you are a paid employee. You know, why do we have this language of covenantal relationship if we're not showing up and caring for one another? So I think we need to be encouraged to deal with our stuff, to be vulnerable about our stuff, and to support one another in healing, because we all got stuff we got to heal. And it's a lifelong journey. We're never going to be healed from everything. We're never going to be perfect. Right? Call me.
So, Michelle, I just want to put in a plug here for the Center for Christian Studies, because their programming includes working through your baggage as you're learning your theologies and stuff. And they also do Con Ed. It's not just the diaconal ministry program. There is some Con Ed opportunity there. And it has truly benefited me in many ways, including, you know, dealing with my trauma and acknowledging my addictions and all of that, and taking that on as part of my ministry process. So, you know, there's my plug for CCS.
Thank you, Jackie. But what help is that when I can learn more about 17th century church practices? I use that all the time in ministry. Said no one ever.
Michele Rowe, you're being bad.
I'm being me.
You are indeed.
I would just like to say, Michelle, I'm enjoying this very much. I'm not a congregational leader, but I've been joining in. This is my second time, joining in a group, because I really feel that we need to talk about trauma, and it is real, and it's amongst our people. And like I'm a spiritual director, and we have a team of spiritual directors at Queen's House. We had a gathering last Friday afternoon, and we were just, you know, opening ourselves to this too. What's changed in how we're accompanying people? And one of the things that we were noticing is that we can be the frontline person for somebody finding actually what they need. And so we gathered a list of resource persons that we can, and sometimes when we walk with people, we walk with them to take that step, just like the lady talked about the person who wanted to go to the chiropractor. Now, there are other things, and you sort of walk with these people to take that next step. So I really appreciated your outline a lot, and I wouldn't mind having a copy of your presentation. And anyway, thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much for that. And I'm sure, Sean, you can probably email it to people, right?
I think what we're going to do is make sure that that gets to Kent, and Kent tends to have a way through the region to get it distributed to folks on this who have signed up for the event. So we'll make sure that we get that to him and get it out to you folks.
Because why should I do it when I have people? I'll have my people email you, Adeline. I'll have my people send it.
Is it over or is there more questions?
No, you can keep, I think we have till 8:30, don't we?
Yeah, we've
So,
got a
like-
couple more minutes yet, yeah.
So I get like empowering people and healing, but what about when there's no healing or empowerment, or, you know, it just gets worse and worse and worse and worse until you die? Or it's like you're dying, not a person.
Sometimes I think the only healing that people have is the understanding in some ways that at some point they're going to be okay. And it might not be in this life.
Dying.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes dying is the okay.
Because it's too much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is too much. You know, like I wouldn't have become a minister if my daughter wouldn't have died. But to say that, you know, I'm never going to come to a place where I say, you know, everything happens for a reason. Good thing my daughter died so I could help other people in ministry, because that's not the way that it goes. And that's the only understanding. I guess that's how do we let ourselves participate in God's love for us. So life is really, really hard, but guess what? There are people who show up alongside of me. And maybe all they can do is the things that you do, Em, for people, which is kick butt all over the place to make sure that people get what they need, or at least something.
But Rev, she never got what she needed. It was just a bunch of, I didn't do anything. That's all.
You show up and you listen and you care. And for some people, they've never had that. They've never had anyone believe enough in them to listen to them. So it's not everything, but it's something. You know, my daughter phoned today and said, my granddaughter, she went to parent-teacher interviews, and two of the teachers said, I've never had a student that says thank you to me after every class, but Reese does. And, you know, my daughter said how proud she was of her. And I thought, because I'm really mad about stuff that's going on in my town where churches are having these trucker convoys, lifting them up and inviting us to come to this conservative party thing. And I'm just like shaking my head. Anyways, the thought came to me, every act of kindness that we put into the world is a mini act of rebellion. And dang it, I'm not going to stop. So some days that's all we have, is that little kindness that we put into the world as an act of rebellion. And we show up to participate in God's love. It's not enough. It is not enough, but it's something.
I've been watching the TV the last few days and the congresswomen, the Democratic congresswomen who are talking about their experience with abortion, personal, just has blown me away that they've been so vulnerable, you know, so public.
Yeah. Vulnerability is a superpower, I'm telling you. Dexter?
Along the way, as you spoke, I thought about how disempowering and how traumatizing continuing grinding poverty is. And I was really struck by your comments, Catherine, about how the systems that are put in place supposedly to help people disempower them and take away all their choices. and how do we come to a place where we can recognize that and change things? And certainly I celebrate what you did for that fellow. But interesting insights. And of course, the question remaining is, so when do I take away people's choices and disempower them? And how do I do that? And how do I come to a place where I recognize that and reform, repent, and change?
Or when do I stand up for my own choices and not let other people, you know, bowl me over and, okay, I'll give it up. That's not healthy either.
Yes. Amen, sister. Anyone else maybe want to jump in with something that's rattling around the old squirrel cage and you haven't let it out yet?
As always. Oh, sorry.
I see tired faces. This is a lot. So
well, what you've done is what you're so good at doing, Michelle, and that's opening a can of worms. And it's a can of worms we need to open, you know, and you're great at it. And thank you for doing that with us tonight. Those worms are going to be coming out, and I'm hoping that this is the beginning of a series of conversations, whether it happens in sort of formal spaces like this or informal times. I think we're starting to learn the language of trauma and trauma-informed ministry. And Michelle, I know you started talking about this. Yes, release the worms, indeed. You started talking about this to me. I remember you talking about this about 1.5 years ago. And, you know, people are starting to catch on. So thank you for helping us get onto this path. Thank you everybody for being here tonight. This is our final practically prophetic webinar for the season. We'll figure out how we reconvene in the fall, either in this form or in another form. But I know some of you have been to many of these webinars, and I really appreciate you coming out. And I know Kent gives his greetings. He's been shepherding this group for quite a while too. So
yeah. Sean, I'm just going to share my screen for a minute just to
show the resources.
Yeah, well, it'll be in the email to people, but I just want to give some contact information if anybody wants to. I'll go through this if anybody wants to get a hold of me. So that's my information. So if this is, you know, something on a larger scale, you'd like to delve into a little bit deeper, that's my information there, and it'll also be in the email, the presentation that you get. But yeah, this is heavy work, but I have a lot of passion for it, and I have a lot of passion for caring for people in the church, and so it's something that I hope we will be able to explore a bit more. And thank you so much. It was so wonderful to see friendly, empathetic faces and to have so many people just, I know how much you love and care for the people that you are in community with. And, you know, it's a tough slog, but remember to participate in God's love for you. And may God, the Creator, who created you, and Jesus who came for you, and the Spirit who abides within and around you, bless and keep you until we're together again. And if there's something I can do to support you in your ministry, please reach out.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you so much. I'm gonna stop recording. We're going to